The rain tapped softly against the library windows as Edward Hale adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning old manuscripts with restless intensity. The narrator explained that Edward was a historian, known for his relentless search for answers. He whispered, "Why do these dates not align?" His voice carried a tremor of obsession. Across the room, Professor Margaret Cole, an academic, raised an eyebrow and said, "Edward, you are chasing shadows again." He tightened his jaw and muttered, "Or perhaps I'm the only one not blinded by them." The shelves towered above, their dusty volumes holding secrets no one dared touch. Lightning flashed, and in that instant, Edward felt the weight of centuries bending toward him. He believed something had been deliberately altered in history, and tonight was the beginning of a dangerous unraveling. The narrator lingered on the moment. As the library grew darker, the storm outside echoing the storm within Edward's mind, the narrator revealed that Edward did not sleep that night, haunted by questions that refused silence. He muttered, "If these centuries never existed, then every truth I've believed collapses." At dawn, he walked across the cobbled courtyard toward the university archives. The air was damp and heavy, the storm's remnants clinging to the morning. Margaret Cole followed at a distance, cautious but intrigued. She whispered, "You are risking your career, Edward." He glanced back with dark circles under his eyes and replied, "Then my career's a small price for the truth." The creak of the heavy iron doors announced their arrival at the archives, where ancient records waited to challenge their sanity. Inside the archives, the narrator described the air as heavy with centuries of silence. Edward lit a small lamp, his breath visible in the cold. He whispered, "This is where the truth lies." Margaret crossed her arms and sighed, "Or where you will bury yourself in madness." Rows of shelves loomed like grave markers, their labels faded. Edward ran his fingers across the spines, stopping at a ledger bound in cracked leather. His pulse quickened as he opened it, revealing contradictions in recorded coronations. The narrator emphasized that Edward felt history itself resisting his touch, as though the centuries wished to remain hidden. The narrator explained how Edward traced his finger along the dates, each line revealing impossible gaps. He muttered, 300 years, missing like smoke." Margaret's voice cut sharply, "Fabrications are dangerous claims." She leaned closer, suspicion mixing with concern. Edward looked at her with wild eyes, whispering, "Or they are the only claims worth making." The air grew colder, as though the walls themselves disapproved of their presence. Dust floated in the lamp glow, turning the space into a chamber of secrets. Outside, church bells rang faintly, their sound dissonant with the evidence in Edward's trembling hands. The narrator said, Edward felt his obsession deepening, the archive suffocating around him. He whispered, "If emperors were crowned in years that never existed, then their power was illusion." Margaret shook her head. "You are unraveling history itself." He slammed the ledger shut, echo reverberating through the chamber. His voice cracked, then let history tremble. The narrator described how Margaret hesitated, torn between dismissing him and fearing he might be right. A draft whistled through the narrow windows, carrying the cold breath of forgotten centuries. Edward's shadow stretched long across the floor, a figure caught between truth and madness. The narrator said the archive felt like a sealed vault, and Edward Hale welcomed the pressure. He whispered, "If time was forged, the ledgers will confess." Margaret Cole drew close and replied, "Confessions can be coerced by need." He steadied his breath and traced a royal charter, noting a coronation wedged between missing feasts. He said, "Holidays vanish, yet kings remain." She answered, "Clerks err, and myths harden." The reading room clock ticked in stiff intervals, a metronome for obsession. Dust spiraled in lamplight, and the air shivered with old glue and dry leather. The narrator observed that Edward's focus narrowed until dates became wounds. He said, "These gaps are not errors, they are seams." Margaret looked to the door and murmured, "Seams invite tearing." He did not look up, and the room seemed to tilt toward the ledger. The narrator explained that the charter led to a sealed case, and the seal dared them to break it. Edward said, "Truth does not respect locks." Margaret exhaled and replied, "But careers do." He signed the request log and waited while the clerk vanished into the stacks. Rain tapped a faster rhythm on the window, and a draft crawled along the floor. He murmured, "Festivals skip 3 centuries, yet the tax rolls march on." She said, "Power does not skip, it edits." The clerk returned with a ledger bound in black skin, and the smell of iron gall rose like smoke. Edward opened it and found a census that counted births in a year with no spring. He said, "Time keeps breathing, even when records hold their breath." Margaret folded her arms, and doubt and fear shared the same chair. The narrator said the lamps dimmed as if the room sensed a trespass. Edward scanned columns where families grew without festivals, and the ink shook like a held breath. He whispered, "The year is numbered, but the seasons are mute." Margaret answered, "Administrations survive where rituals fail." He pointed at an annotation, a neat hand citing a decree that no one had ever taught. He said, "Edicts in a vacuum, authority without days." She replied, "Authority needs only witnesses and fear." The quiet broker's footsteps stopped short of their table. A man cleared his throat and said, "You are reading a palimpsest of obedience." The narrator marked the entrance of the stranger, whose voice carried danger and invitation. The narrator introduced Elias Voss as a man who spoke like a locked door. Elias said, "You will find the gap printed as certainty." Edward replied, "Certainty fears daylight." Elias placed a folded map on the table and said, "Then follow the places where daylight never reaches." Margaret said, "And why guide us into a pit?" Elias answered, "Because you already live at its edge." The map showed monasteries that copied time rather than faith, and routes that braided missing years into trade. Edward said, "These roads dodge the calendar like thieves." Elias nodded and said, "Thieves are often hired." The room hummed with the rain, and the narrator felt the archive shrink to the size of that folded map. The narrator said evening wrapped the city, and suspicion learned their names. Edward closed the map and said, "Who pays for stolen time?" Elias answered, "Those who profit from silence." Margaret asked, "And where do we meet silence?" Elias replied, "In a hall where records are bound before they are written." Edward felt the corridor tilt, and the clock stuttered like a failing heart. He said, "Then we knock." Elias smiled and said, "No, you walk as if invited." Margaret whispered, "We will not be invited." The narrator held the moment as the rain eased, and 3 shadows merged on the stone as they left the archive for a building no directory name. The narrator said the unmarked building breathed like a sealed lung. Edward Hale tested the handle and found it already unlocked. He whispered, "Someone expects us." Margaret Cole replied, "Then someone scripts us." Elias Voss tilted his head and said, "Walk as if you belong." A corridor stretched ahead, paneled in dark oak and lined with blank frames. The narrator marked how silence gathered like dust on a ledger. Edward stepped lightly and counted doors as if counting years. He murmured, "These walls remember what paper forgets." Margaret answered, "And they curate what we should not see." Elias paused at a brass plate and smiled without warmth. He said, "The Hall of Compilations." The lock yielded with a soft click, like a date corrected by a careful hand. The narrator held their breath with the building. The narrator explained that the room contained binding frames, inkstones, and stacks of blank folios. Edward said, "Records are born here before they live." Margaret replied, "Or before they replace the living." Elias unfolded a permit stamped with a crest, "No offices used." He said, "This opens drawers that do not exist." A cabinet slid forward to reveal indexes without authors. Edward traced a column where festivals were reassigned to different reigns. He whispered, "Holidays drift like ships, and kings arrive where the tide is favorable." Margaret shook her head and said, "This is not error, it is choreography." The narrator watched the lamp tremble as footsteps approached. A shadow filled the doorway and waited to be recognized. The narrator introduced Adrian Mercer, whose voice could file a man into a catalog. Adrian said, "You search for truth in a staging room." Edward replied, "Stages tell more than sermons." Adrian smiled and said, "Only to those who mistake rehearsal for history." Margaret asked, "Why monitor rehearsals?" He answered, "To prevent accidents." Elias watched the exchange with a scholar's patience. The narrator noted how Adrian's umbrella left deliberate circles on the stone. Edward lifted a ledger stamped with 3 rulers for 1 winter. He said, "Here is an accident repeated as policy." Adrian's eyes cooled. He said, "Close that, and I will walk you out by the correct door." The hallway swallowed the last echo. The narrator said the air thickened with choices. Adrian stepped nearer and said, "You will publish nothing from here." Edward answered, "Then I will publish what lies outside." Adrian's smile barely moved. He said, "Outside is what we compose inside." Margaret whispered, "Threats are admissions." Elias placed the forged permit on the table and said, "This came from your desk." Adrian did not blink. He said, "Authenticity is a mood." Edward turned the ledger and revealed marginalia that cited a festival moved 3 centuries forward. He said, "Moods do not move saints." The narrator felt the room tilt as if history shifted under their feet. Somewhere a clock corrected itself and erased a chime. The narrator recorded how Adrian withdrew, then offered a path that sounded like mercy. Adrian said, "Follow me, and the calendar will make sense." Edward replied, "Sense without proof is theater." Adrian tilted his head and said, "Then let me show you the stage's foundation." They moved through a service stair where the walls sweated with old lime. Margaret murmured, "We are being sorted." Elias said, "We are being demonstrated." A basement door opened onto shelves labeled with dates that never happened. Edward stared and said, "These are years awaiting occupants." Adrian answered, "They already have occupants." The narrator ended the scene as a single bulb flickered over boxes that hummed with names. The narrator explained that the vault exhaled a stale breath of lost centuries. Edward Hale whispered, "Here lies history without witnesses." Margaret Cole replied, "Or lies pretending to be history." Elias Voss traced a shelf marked with vanished years, murmuring, "Absence preserved as presence." Adrian Mercer stood tall and said, "Absence is the strongest proof." Edward snapped, "It is the strongest fraud." The shelves rattled faintly, as though the dates longed for recognition. Margaret's voice trembled, "If this is true, then we are walking in shadows of time that never existed." Elias warned, "Shadows are harder to escape than facts." The narrator noted how Edward's eyes gleamed with obsession as he stepped deeper into the vault, as though the missing centuries were calling his name. The narrator revealed that deeper inside, a single desk sat with a book chained to it. Edward said, "This is the ledger that anchors the lie." Adrian countered, "This is the ledger that anchors civilization." Margaret whispered, "Civilization built on ghosts will collapse." Adrian's eyes narrowed, "Collapse is better than chaos." Elias leaned over the chained book and muttered, "Chains are for prisoners, not for truth." Edward opened the ledger and gasped at entries, listing emperors reigning across centuries that official calendars denied. He whispered, "Phantoms with crowns." Margaret's hands shook, her voice breaking, "And we built our lives on them." The narrator described silence filling the chamber, broken only by the scratch of Edward's frantic notes. The narrator described how Edward flipped pages faster, each entry dragging him deeper. He muttered, "The centuries never lived, but the rulers still did." Margaret said, "Then the rulers are illusions." Adrian smiled coldly. "Illusions wield the sharpest power." Elias pointed at marginal notes written by different hands. He said, "This ledger was rewritten many times." Edward's jaw tightened, rewritten to erase and replace. Adrian's voice rose, rewritten to preserve order. Margaret pressed her palm to the wall and whispered, "Then order is wrought." The narrator lingered on the growing clash, the vault walls trembling as if they remembered centuries of suppression. The narrator said Edward's frenzy stopped when he found an entry tied to a forgotten family name. He whispered, This is connected to Catherine Gray." Margaret gasped. "The woman who vanished without record?" Adrian stepped closer, saying, "Some names are meant to vanish." Elias murmured, "Or meant to catalyze." Edward's hand trembled over the name, his voice breaking. She was erased to make the missing centuries believable. Margaret whispered, "Her tragedy is the seam holding this fabrication together." Adrian said firmly, "Her tragedy is necessary silence." The narrator recorded the moment as Edward's obsession sharpened, for he now held not just an idea, but a human tragedy tied to the void. The narrator explained that the chamber seemed to contract, as if the walls wished to bury the secret again. Edward shouted, "She is the proof of their crime." Margaret answered softly, "She is the wound that bleeds across centuries." Adrian's voice snapped, "No wound, only necessity." Elias said, "Necessity is just a mask." Edward slammed the ledger shut, dust rising, echoes shaking the vault. He declared, "Then history will no longer tremble alone." Margaret's eyes welled, torn between fear and admiration. Adrian's jaw tightened, his control showing cracks. The narrator ended the scene with the sound of the chain rattling, as if history itself resisted release. The narrator explained that the night bled into a corridor of suspicion. Edward Hale whispered, "The ledger proves the centuries were stolen." Margaret Cole replied, "But proof in chains cannot breathe." Elias Voss said softly, "Proof needs allies, not chains." Adrian Mercer's tone sharpened. "Allies fracture faster than paper." Edward's eyes narrowed, "Then fractures will become cracks." The narrator noted footsteps echoing from behind. A new voice emerged, calm and familiar. "Edward, you always looked where you should not." Edward froze, recognizing Thomas Hale, his estranged brother, stepping from shadow. Margaret gasped. "Family." Elias murmured, "Betrayal carries the deepest blade." The narrator marked the air tightening as family became weapon. The narrator revealed Thomas Hale's voice carried both venom and regret. He said, "You always craved secrets, brother, even when they were poison." Edward whispered, "And you craved silence even when it killed truth." Margaret muttered, "This is the betrayal that scars deeper than lies." Adrian said with calm satisfaction, "Blood knows where to strike." Elias studied Thomas and remarked, "He has worn two faces for years." Edward's voice shook, "You knew Catherine Gray's name, and you buried it." Thomas replied, "I buried you, Edward, long before her." The narrator lingered on Edward's trembling hands, fists torn between rage and grief. The narrator said, Edward lunged with words sharper than blades. He cried, "You were my brother, yet you sided with ghosts." Thomas answered, "I sided with survival." Margaret stepped forward and said, "Survival that sacrifices truth is cowardice." Adrian's voice slid between them, "Cowardice preserves order." Elias whispered, "Order preserved by betrayal is rot disguised as structure." Edward's jaw trembled, his voice breaking. "Catherine's erasure was your doing." Thomas replied coldly, "Her silence was my duty." The narrator noted how Edward's eyes flooded with loss, the ledger's weight now mirrored by betrayal's crushing truth. The narrator described a silence that weighed heavier than chains. Edward whispered, "You chose their order over our blood." Thomas's voice hardened, "Blood spills, order remains." Margaret's hand shook, "You destroyed her life to build a lie." Adrian said coldly, "Lies are bricks of stability." Elias muttered, "Until truth kicks them down." Edward's voice cracked, "You betrayed me to bury centuries that never were." Thomas replied with steady eyes, "And I would do it again." The narrator said Edward's grief ignited into rage, and the corridor seemed too narrow to contain both brothers' shadows. The narrator revealed the confrontation, ended not in closure but fracture. Edward shouted, "Then you are no brother to me." Thomas answered, "Family is the first lie." Margaret cried, "And truth is the last wound." Adrian's voice echoed, "Wounds are useful reminders." Elias muttered, "But reminders sharpen blades." Edward's chest heaved, his rage swallowing grief. He whispered, "If I must fight both the centuries and my own blood, then so be it." Thomas's eyes darkened and he said, "Then history itself will crush you." The narrator closed the scene as the corridor fell into silence, with only the storm outside roaring like time itself breaking. The narrator said dawn found Edward Hale walking like a man inside a verdict. Ah, the city wore last night's rain, and the papers wore his name. He whispered, "They have turned rumor into doctrine." Margaret Cole replied, "Doctrines are loud when funded." Adrian Mercer's statement appeared in every column, asserting propriety and safeguarding tradition. Elias Voss said, "He is laying a silk noose." Edward read that he had forged permissions and mishandled artifacts, and his stomach dropped like a bell weight. He answered, "They accuse me of what their ledgers perform." Margaret folded a paper and said, "Then we answer with evidence sharper than fear." Edward nodded, yet his eyes carried the tremor of a man being framed by a calendar. The narrator marked how the city's clocks seemed to tick in unison with the headline's rhythm. The narrator explained that a disciplinary board convened under chandeliers and caution. Adrian Mercer presided with a smile trained to resemble sympathy. Edward said, "Let the records speak." Adrian replied, "They already have." Margaret placed the copied marginalia before the panel and said, "These notes move a saint 300 years. Elias added, "And these permits carry seals from offices that never existed." A hush fell as the panelists traded glances like contraband. Adrian lifted a hand and said, "Irregularities are not conspiracies." Edward answered, "They are scaffolds for one." The narrator described the way fear traveled down the long table, then settled in the minutes where decisions harden. The narrator said the judgment arrived dressed as procedure. Adrian announced that Edward's access would be revoked pending review. Edward whispered, "Review by whom?" Adrian answered, "By those who preserve order." Margaret leaned in and said, "Order stumbles when records contradict themselves." Elias slid a photograph across the table, showing the sub-basement shelves labeled with impossible years. He said, "Your foundation leaks." Adrian did not blink. He replied, "The photograph is a misunderstanding of a staging archive." Edward's voice grew steady, "Then open it for all to see." The narrator noted that silence swallowed the request, and a pen scratched the minutes with a verdict shaped like delay. The narrator revealed that afternoon brought a raid disguised as inventory. 2 clerks boxed Edward's notes while a steward cited protocol. Edward said, "You are confiscating questions." The steward replied, "We are securing continuity." Margaret stepped between them and said, "Continuity hates sunlight." Elias lifted the chained ledger copy and slipped a duplicate into his coat. He murmured, "Continuity will have a twin." Adrian appeared in the doorway like a signature at the bottom of a decree. He said, "You may keep your memories, not the papers." Edward answered, "My memory will be indexed by grief." The narrator watched the last box leave, and the room felt suddenly reorganized into absence. The narrator said twilight drew long lines across the chapel courtyard where decisions ripen. Edward stood at the steps and finally exhaled the day's weight. He whispered, "They will erase me before I publish a word." Margaret replied, "Then we give the word to 1,000 mouths." Elias said, "I know a press that breathes between issues." Footsteps approached, and Thomas Hale emerged from the cloister with eyes that were both mirror and wound. Thomas said, "Go home, Edward." Edward answered, "Home ended when you signed their silence." Thomas looked away and said, "You will break and they will not notice." Edward replied, "Then let breaking be the notice." The narrator closed on a wind that smelled like rain and old stone, and a resolve that finally chose its cost. The narrator said night pressed close as Edward Hale followed Elias Voss toward the river warehouses. He whispered, "If the ledger breathes, it breathes here." Margaret Cole replied, "Then we hold our breath." Elias said, "Adrian keeps a private archive where light is licensed." They reached a steel door that hummed like a sealed confession. Edward murmured, "Open what orders forbid." The lock yielded to a thin key, and the corridor tasted of oil and ink. Margaret said, "If we are wrong, we lose careers." Edward answered, "If we are right, we gain history." The narrator felt the building lean inward, like a jury that already chose its verdict. Footsteps above them paused, then resumed, as if time noticed their trespass and decided to wait. The narrator explained that the private archive was a theater of order. Boxes marched in rows labeled with rulers and years that never met. Edward said, "Phantoms standing at attention." Margaret replied, "Or witnesses gagged by labels." Elias lifted a lid and revealed certificates authorizing feast days, centuries adrift. He said, "Calendars trained to heal." Edward found a dossier stamped with Catherine Gray's crest. He whispered, "She was reassigned to a year that did not exist." Margaret's breath caught. A life folded to justify the gap. The narrator marked the room growing smaller as the pages multiplied. The ceiling ticked with steam pipes, and every tick felt like a seal closing. The narrator said a soft click announced Adrian Mercer, who closed the door with a gentle certainty. Adrian said, "You trespass into the grammar of survival." Edward answered, "Survival does not need erasures." Adrian walked between aisles and replied, "Civilizations edit, or they die unproofed." Margaret stepped forward and said, "You rewrote a woman to stitch a hole." Adrian's gaze cooled. She was already thread. Elias whispered, "Thread can strangle." Adrian offered a ledger embossed in gold and said, "Read the cost of leaving the gap unfilled." The narrator felt the choice grow fanged. Edward opened the gilded book and met futures that ended in riots and fires. The narrator described pages that showed cities saved by fictive reigns and crowds, calmed by invented saints. Edward said, "Fear is doing your proof." Adrian replied, "Outcomes are proofs." Margaret pointed at Catherine Gray's sealed deposition. She said, "She refused the reassignment." Adrian sighed, and silence served her better. Elias slid a thin envelope to Edward and said, "Not silent." Inside lay Catherine's letter, naming the hall and the men who altered her year. Edward whispered, "She chose witness." Adrian's voice thinned. "She chose martyrdom to disorder." The narrator watched Edward's hands steady, as if the letter reassembled his spine. The pipes ticked once, then fell quiet. The narrator said the decision arrived like clean air after a long tunnel. Edward closed the gilded ledger and said, "History survives truth." Adrian answered, "It survives management." Margaret replied, "Then manage with honesty." Elias nodded toward the exit and said, "There is a press waiting." Adrian's eyes cooled, yet he stepped aside and said, "You will publish ambiguity." Edward answered, "Ambiguity is better than absence." The narrator followed them into the river wind, where dawn unstitched the night. Edward raised Catherine Gray's letter to the light and said, "Let the world argue with this." The river took the first sunlight, and the city's clocks began their measured, imperfect day.